welcome everyone to the last PALs of 2024. I'm happy to welcome Dr. Dawn McArthur. She's a PhD who's the Director of Research and Technology and Development, and she works at the BC Children's Hospital Research Institute. And she's graciously agreed to give us all a overview on something that I think all of us are either very familiar with or need a lot of introduction to. So there'll probably be a wide spectrum of knowledge in this area, Dawn, but it's about kind of how to prepare grants. So Dawn, have you been able to share your screen yet? Have you?
Yes, I have.
Okay, perfect. So welcome, Dawn, and take it away.
Thanks, Tyler. Thanks, everyone. Welcome, everyone. So today we have about an hour to talk about something that is pretty much a lifelong learning thing. And it's nice to see some people that I know and others that I don't. And I know that the audience has got a wide range of experience levels. And so I'm hoping that the information that I am going to present will be applicable whether you are a senior researcher with lots of experience or a resident or a grad student with who's just starting out on applying for funding. I try to make it general enough that it would apply to any type of funding that you're applying for, whether it's a scholarship, a fellowship, a small grant, a large grant. The approaches are very similar, and that so we're not targeting a particular type of funding application. It's all health research, obviously, because some other domains of research are a little bit different. And if anyone has specific questions about that, we can talk about it. I'm going to start sharing my slides now. You can put questions in the chat, I believe, and I'm hoping that I get through this quickly enough that we have, a good 10, 15 minutes of discussion time.
Yeah, and I can moderate the discussion after. Thanks,
Thank
Dawn.
you. Remembering that it's only an hour for something that I've been doing full time for a long time and I'm still learning because the target changes all the time. But I'm gonna start sharing and
Yeah, looks good.
alrighty. So I call this competitive research funding proposals from start to finish. So that's just what the scope of what we're gonna get through today. I've been having a few problems with my internet this morning, so if it kicks out, I'll be right back. I'd like to do a land acknowledgement because I have not lived in Vancouver my whole life, although I was born here. And I am very grateful to acknowledge the land in which I live, work, and am a relatively recent settler is the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, especially of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and that I feel very strongly about being a steward of the culture and the lands. Our learning objectives for today are to gain some effective strategies, and you'll hopefully be able to personalize some of these for thinking about and planning your research and converting those ideas into an easily reviewed proposal. Because the reviewer is the person with all, in the thinking and planning stage, you have all the power, but once you get into being reviewed, it's the reviewer that has the power. So let's talk about project development and funding cycles. So, research really is a cycle of moving from an idea to a project. And then if you need funding for that project, you apply for funding. And that comes back to ideas, and you just keep going around and around in this cycle. The grant gets submitted to funded, and it will either get funded, yay, hooray, or not funded, which is the more common phenomenon, and then you have to go back into the cycle. One of the things that people frequently do if this is they go back to this and they start playing with this. My recommendation is always to go back to this and this when you are having to resubmit or you don't get funded. You really need to not just correct the documentation, but go back into the ideas. So we're going to talk about how one can do that. First, I'm going to give an overview, and then I'm going to go through 4 different sort of aspects of thinking, planning, drafting, and refining a funding proposal. Because the overview really sets the stage for how you're going to think about funding proposals. One of the things that is especially common in young researchers and early career researchers is that they tend to tackle grants the same way they tackle other academic writing, like a publication, and they're not like that. They're different because they have one purpose. And what is that? Why do we write grants? Is it to show our knowledge, guide our project, show how well we write? No, it's to get money. It is a tool for getting money. Occasionally, it's a tool for getting access to some resource you need, but most of the time, it's a tool for getting money. It does these things, but that's not what it's about. Publications are about this. Proposals are about, like, a proposal to your supervisor if you're a trainee. But a grant is to get money. That's its sole purpose. And so the guidelines and instructions and the review criteria for any funding opportunity are the requests from that funder. And your proposal is a response to those requests. Sometimes those requests are incredibly vague, and sometimes they're very specific, but your response always has to target that request. So respond to the request. So I'm going to go through a couple slides now about what I think of when I think about proposals that work. And this is sort of a teeter-totter balancing thing of the side that's about you over here and them over there. You get to propose an excellent project that has a scope that fits the funding opportunity. You get to describe how you're qualified to do the research through your experience, your training, your knowledge, whatever, that's relevant and appropriate for your career stage or for the team of people you bring together. And you get to decide all of this. You have all the power over here. Over here, a funder has specific mandates. So the Heart and Stroke Foundation funds heart and stroke. The Lung Foundation funds lung. Multiple sclerosis funds multiple sclerosis, etc. And they have priorities. And those priorities change over time a lot of the time. Most funders do, 5-year strategic planning. So it's a good idea to go and look at what that is and see whether or not you fit what they have in their priorities and their mandates for the funder. And you get to choose this. Then down here, you also have to target the right audience and address the needs of a reviewer, because this is the decision maker right here. This is where you have no power at all, except for to try and make this balance as tight as possible. So proposals that work propose excellent research that will be done by qualified researchers. They are targeting the right type of funding opportunity, and they're making it as easy to read for the type of audience that's reviewing it. Not all reviewers are peer reviewers, scientific reviewers. Some reviewers are community reviewers. Some reviewers are business people or legal people or patient partners. You don't know, you need to find that out, but you don't have any power over the choice of reviewers. So proposals that work will address a key question or a knowledge gap, and you need to be able to say why the question you're addressing, the hypothesis you're testing, or the information you're gathering is important. So they have an identifiable impact. That impact might not be immediate. It might be long-term, but you need to be able to identify why it matters. They're also realistic and feasible. Feasibility is the aspect of, can you do what you're proposing to do with the money that you're going to have in the time you think it's going to take? Now, in research, it's always an educated guess. It's never carved in stone. There are some funders who actually want you to pretty much carve it in stone. Genome Canada, Genome BC is one. The Lawson Foundation is one. There are some other ones where they really want a work plan. But most open investigative driven funding doesn't. But the reviewer is going to decide whether or not it's realistic and feasible. The documentation or whatever it is you submit should be focused and well organized so the reviewer finds what they need to find as easily as they need. And they use simple, clear language. And we can talk about that in the chat, but it doesn't mean not using the language of your field. What it means is not assuming the reader understands your jargon. So there are some things you have to define, some things you don't have to define, but a complex sentence structure is not easy to read. It takes work. We want to make it as easy as possible for a reviewer. So we want to try and learn simple, clear language. Ultimately, proposals that work are not really about your side of that balance. They're not really about what you want to say. They're not really about writing or language. So you'll notice that I tend to avoid saying grant writing. They're not about problems or descriptions of things. They're about the flip side. They're about what do they want to know? What do they need to know? What are the review criteria? What is your reviewer looking for? It's about a reader, not a writer. You are the reader, sorry, you are the writer if you're writing a text grant, but the reader is making a decision. And those are different parts of our brain. They're not about language, they're about research. So language can get in the way of research, but research is what's being evaluated. They're not really about problems, they're about finding solutions to problems. Every grant I have ever read in my entire life is trying to make things better. They're trying to find ways to solve problems, to answer questions, to fill knowledge gaps. And they're a very different kind of writing than we experience in most academics and life, actually. They're a persuasive document, not just a descriptive document. Pretty much everything else we write is a descriptive document, but a grant is not. So we need to try and make sure that we address this. We also need to remember a few things. Sorry, I need to move this bar. Okay, that's okay. Research is difficult. It takes training and practice, and so is developing a competitive proposal. We work very hard, and depending on how big the competition is, the more training and practice you need, and the more you're sort of aiming for a target you don't even really know. And in recent years, it's been my experience that reviewers are getting a little bit more random than they used to be, in part because the funding rates are going down. So for Canadian Institutes of Health Research right now, the funding rate is about 15%. That means 85% of proposals are not going to get funded in any given competition. And so trying to get yourself into that top 15% has a level of subjectivity and randomness to it. And training and practice do help with that. Developing a successful proposal takes time. Make sure you have it. If you want to do a funding proposal for something like CIHR project grant or anything that's external to your institution, you really can't cram it. You really need to take the time to develop it. And if you are a social scientist and you're doing SHRC, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, 50% of the grant score in a SHRC grant is on the literature review. So you really need to take the time to do that. With health research and like basic science, like physics and chemistry in Canada, they care less about literature review. They care about rationale and background, but not so much a comprehensive review. But you still have to develop a strong research project and program. It's important to remember public proposals are not publications. They're a tool for getting money and they have no life beyond review. And they're going to be read by maybe 3 people. So it's not a publication. If you did a really strong literature review of some sort, take it out of your grant and publish it, because no one else is going to see it. They're confidential documents. They have no life beyond review. We also need to remember reviewers are very busy and tired, and they're doing their reviewer job on top of everyday life, and we need to make their job as easy as possible. And I'm going to talk about some ways we can do that. It's also really important to remember it's a competition. I've only ever seen one tie in my entire life, but reviewers have to rank your grants. And that means sometimes finding really silly, minuscule, not very important differences in order to put one grant above and below, like to rank one higher than one lower than the other. And even though they're essentially the same, it's their job. It's what they have to do. The other thing I think this brings up for me is something that I have sort of developed over the course of my life. And that's to try and take more of a, not to take an academic perspective to grants in that you think, you're striving for an A or something like that. What is important is to strive to do for the thing that we're more socialized to do, which is that's competitive, with something like sports or a music competition or a dance competition or something, an art, like a juried art show or something, where you have done your best and then someone else is going to make a decision about it. And you don't necessarily consider that a failure, you consider it a, I didn't do that well that day. So like we are socialized when we're brought up to recognize that we're not going to win every game we play. And so it's probably important for one's sanity and self-esteem to try and get a perspective of, I'm going to do my best. I'm going to learn how to do my grants development the best way I know how, but somebody's going to have a better day some, half the time. And don't beat yourself up if you don't get funded, because it's not a failure per se of you if you did your best job. I like to think of proposal development in two stages, really. You're making the plan and you're crafting the proposal. And so in this presentation, I'm going to go through thinking, planning, drafting, and refining. And after you refine, turf it off to the funding agency. Let's talk about thinking. Well, so when you're thinking about your research program, especially when you're an early career person or you're somebody looking to fund a new direction in your research or something like that, it's really important to think about the research you need to fund. What exactly are the activities you want to fund? What kind of funding do you need? Do you need to buy equipment? Do you need to buy consumables? Do you need to travel? Do you need to have focus groups? Do you need to collect samples? Do you need access to sequencing equipment or imaging equipment or something like that? You need to think hard about what it is you actually need to do in a practical way, because that's when you can figure out what sort of scope of funding do you need? Like, do you need $20,000 or $200,000 or somewhere in the middle? Where can you find funding? I get asked that question all the time, so I'm going to go through a bit of that. And once you find a funding opportunity, how do you apply? How do you figure out how to apply? One of the things that I teach trainees and early career investigators, and Jonathan, you might have seen this before, is something that I call a research polygon, that you just draw a circle or a shape. And in the middle, you write your main topic or question. And then around the edges, and I took out my example of this, because it was an extra slide, but I'll describe. And then you list the type of disciplines and groups or agencies or users or partners, or stakeholders is not a great word. Partners, I should change that to partners, and or decision makers who care about it. And then you use that list as keywords to search for funding. So the example I usually give in training is why did the chicken cross the road? And on the outside, I put ornithologists, behaviorists, biologists, agriculture, poultry science, farming, infectious diseases and public health because of avian influenza. And then, you might put traffic control, road surfacing, fencing, I don't know, various different things that have to do with the chicken, the road, and the why. And I just sort of make up stuff, brainstorm stuff on the outside and use that as keywords to search for funding. Where would you search? Well, university research offices are one of the best places to find lists of funding. They don't get updated very often, although at UBC, the Faculty of Medicine sends out lists of funding like once a month. And if you can get on that list, if you're faculty, I think you're automatically on the list, but if you're not, I think you just email and ask to get on the list. The Office of Research Services has lists on their site. The Faculty of Medicine has lists on their site. The Faculty of Grad Studies and the postdoc office have lists on their sites. There's lists everywhere. Then you also funders. So there's funding agencies, the government, there are foundations that fund things. So, the hospital foundations will fund things. The provincial and federal governments fund lots of things. Health Canada funds things. Public Health Agency of Canada, Environment Canada, Industry Canada, they all fund things. And then, of course, there's things like the Tri-Agency, which is CIHR, Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, and Social Sciences and Engineering Research Council, which is the bread and butter funding of academia in Canada. And then there's, disease and population specific foundational targets like Diabetes Canada, Heart and Stroke Foundation, multiple sclerosis, Crohn's and colitis, a whole variety of different things. And so what I did when I started this kind of work as a postdoc is I gave myself like an hour a week when I was starting, and I tried to create myself a little library of things that are relevant to the funding that I was looking for. And I would suggest doing that. There are also some databases. Now, Pivot is a database of international funding opportunities. UBC does not have a subscription to it anymore, but lots of other Canadian universities do. U of T does, Western does, McGill does. And if you can access it, it's a really great searchable database. There's also a national database of Canadian government funding that is searchable. And there's also some BC-based grants if you do community-based research, especially, or any particular targeted type stuff. When you have the keywords, just use Google or whatever your search engine is and type them in there. Make sure you put Canada if you're working in Canada. And you will eventually find the sorts of things you need. You can also sign up for university website, as I said, feeds. And you can also go through social media, RSS feeds, and newsletters. And depending on, who your funder is and what you want, everybody's got social media and everybody's got some sort of a newsletter or list. So depending on who you are and what your interests are, you can sign up for the relevant ones. I, of course, have them all. Once you find a request for applications or a funding opportunity, so request for applications, it might be request for proposals, or it might in American terms. So NIH uses funding opportunity announcement and FOA. For everyone, you need to find out about what are the priorities and objectives. So you're looking at that circle that's funding mandate and priorities. What are the applicant requirements and eligibility? Do you fit them? What are the deadlines? That's really important because that's the issue of, do you have time? What are the guidelines? What do you need to do? What is the format and the requirements? Who's reviewing it? And what are they reviewing it for? And also, what have they funded before, to see whether or not you look like one of the things they might want to fund? It also gives you a sense of what kind of language and approach they like. If you don't understand the instructions, and I promise you, you won't, make sure that you ask for clarification. Don't make assumptions. Assumptions are bad. If you don't understand it, it doesn't mean it was well written and clear, because they're not. So just ask. Make sure you're ready to apply. A lot of the time, and I was having a conversation with someone just yesterday who I think is trying to apply too early. I don't think they're ready to apply. So you can make yourself a to-do list of a timeline and some kind of checklist of what you need to submit. And if you need letters from people or whatever, if you need to develop a collaboration or partnership, for example, you're working with a community or you're working with a particular group of patients, you want to make sure you have this established before you apply for funding to do any actual research. You need to know where the tools and resources are. If you have incomplete work that you need to know the answer to before you apply for the next phase of funding, do it. So perform pilot studies if you need to, finish incomplete work. The money should really be the only thing besides ethics approval that you need for the project. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but if you're applying for funding to meet with people to talk about it, like a CIHR planning grant or a Michael Smith convening to collaborate grant, then obviously some of these things are more about this stuff up here than they are about this down here. So it really depends a lot on what it is that you need the money for, about how mature those things need to be. Think about the research before you start with reading papers or writing text. Obviously, especially if you're in a new area, you do need to read the literature and you need to stay up to date with your literature. But reading papers is not necessarily going to inspire you if you're not already got an idea. Writing text also is not where you're going to find an answer unless that is the tool that you use to brainstorm. I only know a couple people who use text for brainstorming. They're also and I'm going to say this as a dyed-in-the-wool procrastinator, really good ways to procrastinate actually writing the grant. Start with you thinking about the research. So I think about this in a bunch of different ways. I've broken it down here in 2 or 3 different models that I'm going to go through. One is to think of the problem, the project, the solution. So a lot of the time we're driven by this and we're going backwards up there. Sometimes we're driven by this and we want to skip down to here and not think about this. But you need to ask yourself some questions. What do we know? What don't we know? What do we need to know? And what am I going to find out? Because I'm going to try and find out something, not everything about that topic or that problem. How are we going to try and find it out? What are we going to do in this time period? So let's say it's a 2-year grant and it's $75,000 a year for 2 years. What can that help me do? What do I need to put together to do this? And who are the people I need in place to do it? And the solution is, what are we going to find out or create? I put create here because sometimes I work with people who do art research. But you might be creating a new program or creating a new tool or, an app or a web-based thing or something. So it is relevant in our area too. Why does it matter? How will this help the people that are related up here? And who needs to know about it? Because you will get asked to do something called knowledge translation or knowledge mobilization. And that comes back to back here. These people, who cares about this? Because that is also part of your knowledge translation when you think about that. And it's not just about writing papers. So we can go into this in a little bit more detail. The problem is usually the information in your background section and leads to your rationale. And some research is hypothesis driven. So you would put that here. This data supports the hypothesis that, or it could be question driven, or it could be exploratory. The project is in the methods and approach research plan section. So the study design and the project plan are project. And the solution is the back end and the front end. So usually you can have it in the introductory section and any significance or discussion section because it's the outcomes and impact. One of the things so back here, where it says things like project outcomes, impact, study design, project plan, and project rationale, a long time ago, I broke that down into 6 building blocks: what, why, who, how, outcome, and impact. And I have yet to change this. I think I made this in about 2005, and I haven't changed it because it still works. What is what you're going to do? Why is why it needs to be done? Why you should do it or your team should do it? How you're going to do it? What you're going to find out and why it matters. And those map onto those same things: problem, project, solution. And this is the front end of your grant, the middle of your grant, the back end of your grant in most standard grants. When you're thinking about your research, you need to think about the framework of your ideas, your plans, and your methods. Like, you really have to think hard about what you're going to do. In any health research review or physical and life sciences review, the how part, this part in the middle, this is where the emphasis of the review is, this green section. They're going to care about this and they're going to care about this, but this is really where reviewers are paying the most attention. If you were a social scientist person, they care most about this front end literature review part. So you can ask yourself questions. What am I trying to find out? What is the objective, the question, the goal, the hypothesis? If this, then what, and what next? I personally draw things all the time. I draw the design and framework. I draw out methods, what approaches, like if that doesn't work, what could I do? I think about timelines. I think about what if I'm aiming to have this outcome, but what if I don't? So, you can use a whole variety of different tools and we can talk about those. I'm just going to go through a couple. I'm a physiologist, so I do flow diagrams all the time. Research context and research questions. So this is what and why here. Lead always to your plan. And every plan I have ever seen in my life has 5 basic things. It happens in a setting. It involves groups. It has tools for data collection and measuring things. It has the actual process of data collection, and it has a process of data analysis and interpretation. And that leads to some kind of findings. If it's hypothesis driven, you have an expected finding. Even if it's question driven, you have a prediction, a more open prediction of what you think you'll find. And that has impact of some sort on these context up here. Then you take that impact back to the field and the topic area, and you take it back to the participants and research community in knowledge translation. Those are knowledge translation actions. There's also a knowledge translation action that would be called integrated knowledge translation, where these researchers, participants, and partners are involved in this planning. And that's very common in health research. There's also research that takes place inside these pathways, which is called KT science, and it's the methods of doing this. If you do that, an implementation science also fits inside those arrows, sort of between the arrow and the impact. But it's just a way of flowing through. So you could map your project out that way, or you can map it using a variety of other tools, but you have to think about everything. Who is involved? Who are the researchers? Who are the staff, students, fellows, collaborators, knowledge users, i.e. decision makers? Who's going to use that knowledge? If you're writing clinical practice guidelines, that's going to be fellow clinicians. Who are partners if you're developing something technology based or something, or pharmacological or biotech, there might be a partner. And there's always others. There's always, patient partners or community partners or somebody else. Then you want to think about how that team and group will function in terms of the structure of the team. What kind of leadership do you have? What kind of roles does everyone play? This business of roles and commitments is becoming very the focus of a lot of reviewer comments. Like, I don't see what all the people are going to do. And they want it to be a lot more explicit in many cases. Focus on value-added interdisciplinarity and training is also very important for some. So for an NSERC discovery grant, for example, this is very important. And how are you going to make decisions, and how are you going to resolve conflict is something to think about if there's more than one or two of you involved. Even if there's two of you involved, it's important to have those conversations. What resources do you need? Do you need to be working in the hospital, in the community? Do you need a computer? Do you need to do surveys or focus groups or interviews? Are you doing lab-based work? Do you need to collect samples? Think about it in really, really practical terms, why you're thinking about it, because this is what leads to your budget. And so can go from this and this to the budget. And sometimes people leave their budget till the very, very end, but I strongly recommend against that, because you need your budget to get your signatures from the institution. And the earlier you do that, the more you can check it off your list of things to do and make the research managers happy, because the research services and signatures and people in departments doing signatures, they really hate it when things come to them last minute. Look what I've done to my head. Anyway, you're going to have people, you're going to have materials, some supplies and consumables. You're going to have services of various types. So you might be sending something out to be sequenced, or you might have somebody doing a translation, or you might be having somebody code something, or you might have statistical analysis as an external service. You need to think about that. You often will have travel for either research to like do home visits or community visits or something. People might be coming to you and you want to pay for their parking and their gas. And you'll probably want to put some money in to go to conferences. You have dissemination and knowledge translation, which includes publication costs, costs of making any of the knowledge translation modules. So maybe you're making a video, or you're making like something web-based, or you're making something else. I mean, people do a lot of different things. You might be allowed to buy equipment. Small equipment often goes in materials because it's considered a consumable. So like computers, as long as they don't cost like over $5,000, are usually in materials. And then you might have contributions from your institution or some other partner that you need to think about in your budget. But you need to think about these things early while you're thinking about your project plan. You also need to think about what documents you need because this takes time. So if you need a CV of some sort from various different research partners, start that as early as you can. It takes a lot of time. If they haven't done Common CV, hopefully that's going the way of the dodo very, very soon. But then it's going into a narrative CV, and narrative CVs are a lot more, they require a lot more thinking than fill in the box CVs. So it's changing one kind of work to a different kind of work. And you might need letters or testimonials. You might need a partnership agreement, and you might need some letters. And letters take time. Takes people time to write them, takes people time to get them through the processing of signatures. So don't try and push this stuff through at the last minute. Think about it early and get it started early. Think about the timeline of your project. I mean, you can make one of these for your grant development too. We do it for major projects all the time. Like we're working on Canada Foundation for Innovation right now, and they take like a year to put together. So, but also one of the things about a Gantt chart for your project is that if you go down any period of time, it helps you create your budget because it helps you assess what you need in any given point in time here. So this is part of grant writing. These are things that you're going to need for your grant, but I put them in thinking because they are about mapping stuff out. And you might, let's say, for example, these three things were a year and these three things were a year. You can see that there's probably potentially less budget in this year than there is in this year. But if you only have if you're only allowed to max out at say $100,000 a year, you might need to shift these on your Gantt chart so that you can actually get $100,000 per year. It's just a way of thinking about how you're allocating your money. In the real world, once you get the money, it doesn't have to be mapped that way. You also have to look at knowledge translation and mobilization, and I'm just going to send you to like CIHR and SHRC and NSERC have very specific documentation, and there's masses of reading that one could do, and it's very specific to each type of project. But you do need to have, you will have to put in a plan in a grant, so it's important to think about it. There's also 4 other things that have come up in the last few years, some earlier than others, that reviewers are going to be looking for and that funding agencies are going to be asking you to do. One is patient-oriented community-based research or research with Indigenous peoples. And especially in health research, that is going to be really important in some of your research designs, and those take a lot of work and some reading and some learning about how to do it. Sex and gender-based approaches are essential. Even if you study cells in mice, you still have to look at sex. Obviously not gender, because cells in mice don't have gender. Only humans have gender. And so you need to include that. So if you're only working on one sex of mice, for example, you need to say why. So obviously, if it's about ovaries, you're not going to be working on male mice. You need to think about what falls under the umbrella of equity, diversity, and inclusiveness, and try to include, especially when you're doing something related to an actual patient population or a community, how you're going to try and be inclusive and equitable in the way that you interact and the way that you measure things. And it, again, is very specific to each person's type of research. It is important in both also the way that you run your teams and how trainees are treated and recruited and all that sort of stuff. And again, there's massive amounts you can read about that. And the final one actually is data management plans and risk management plans. So risk management plans have started coming up in the national grants from Canada, and I'm not really, some of them are about, so UBC has an office on risk, on research, risk and security. I can't remember what it's actually called. Data management is going to be really important because they want to know how you're going to protect it, where you're going to store it, how you're going to access it, who's going to have access to it. And it doesn't matter what kind of data it is. Obviously, if it's patient data or any human data, it requires more security and privacy than data from a rock. But they're still going to want to know that. And they keep asking for more and more stuff in grants without giving us more pages to talk about it. And I'm hoping that's gonna like evolve because something's gonna break soon about it. You have to address them somewhere. So let's talk about, oh, I'm getting long here. Drafting your first draft. So you've thought about your project, you've figured out most of what it is, and now you want to translate it to whatever it is that they're asking for. Usually that's a text document. What's really important here is that it's a visual product read by a human, and reading is your goal. Even though you have a tool of language and a process of writing, reading is the goal. There's also some evolving formats going on out there in the grants world where people want videos or slide decks or infographics or some sort of a schematic, currently these days called a graphical abstract. If you get asked for this, I love it. This is more fun, but most of the time still it's a text document. This is a description of what you're doing in academics, writing styles descriptive on ethics applications, consent forms, questionnaires, publications, news stories. The only place we're really persuasive is job applications, scholarships, fellowships, and grants, unless you're a lawyer, and that's a whole different ballgame. So the way that you write for these types of things is different from the way you write for these types of things, and language you choose and things. And we could do an entire workshop just on persuasive language. One of the things about drafting your proposal that I think is a really important thing, I'm going to try and get through these last slides fairly quickly, is be kind to yourself. Do not try to be perfect on a first draft. It should be a mess. It's a sketch of your proposal. It's not the final version. And it should be incomplete. It should be disorganized. It should be shorter or longer, usually longer than the final version. One of the things that I recommend to people sometimes is to try to use 5 or 6 slides to outline what they're going to do. So imagine you're going to give a presentation on it instead, and what 5 or 6 slides would you want to include? You could also use storyboarding, which is to sort of draw out little squares and put info in them, and or you could use post-it notes for the same thing. We use post-it notes a lot because they're easy to move around, and this is the whole point of both the planning and mapping and the frameworks that we've talked about, and this drafting section, which is that you know the content you need to get into format of a document, but you don't really know what all the bits are. And if you start writing it out in words, you're going to get tied to those sentences in your brain. But if you start using something else, like slides or post-it notes or something, you see them as pieces of the puzzle, and then you start being able to put that puzzle together and see how the flow might work. You can also use voice to text. One of the people I work with uses voice to text all the time. And it means he has to read through his text and figure out which parts he likes the best. But some people do like that. But it's just that it should be a mess, okay? Don't try to write to final draft. The building blocks also fit the sections of your grant in a traditional grant. This is the front section, the middle section, and the back section. Here's an abstract that carries those same things with them. Notice this is a CIHR one, and almost everything is how. Do remember your purpose and audience. Use your map. Start in the middle with the project plan. It's usually the easiest place. It's like when you're writing a publication, you usually start with results. Do the summaries in the introduction last. Try to banish the critics. Suspend your perfectionism. First of all, no one has to see it. Second of all, perfectionism is the enemy of getting something done. Concentrate on progress and take breaks if you need to. Ask for clarification if you need to. Do not worry about language, grammar, page or character limits, or anything about the mechanics of the document at this stage of drafting. Just forget that. Do it freeform. Don't try and compose and edit at the same time. One of the big challenges of computers is that we type, we read, we edit. We type, we read, we edit. Try really hard not to do that. Put on a blindfold, put a screen block on somehow. Just try and get it out of your brain. Do not edit yourself on a first draft. Just write it out. Don't try to write everything you know. They don't need to know everything you know. And don't try at this stage to go and read more papers. The answer is not there. And the answer is in your head. Try to keep it simple. Think about one. What is my one goal in this proposal? If the reviewer had to say what the proposal is about, what would they say? Paragraphing and sentence writing are language things. Each paragraph should only have one concept in it. Don't try and smush a whole bunch of stuff together. Paragraphs are there for readability. Each sentence should really only be trying to make one point. That's just a habit to get into. The one goal proposal thing is very much a reviewer thing because they will copy it out. Say this goal is this. Try to use uncomplicated language. I've talked about that before. It's important to target a variety of readers, but this varies a lot with the funding opportunity, and different sections of the grant need to target different things. So methods always has to target a specialist, whereas the other parts of the grant can target a generalist. Some people are very much about concept and some people are very much about details. Methods is always going to have a lot of details in it, and the persnickety reviewer is who's usually a specialist is going to look for that. So methods should always target these two, but other parts can target this. Be positive. Use first person and active voice. You own the grant then, okay? I will do this. We will do this. My group will do this. My team is going to do this. Methods have a traditional tendency to be in passive voice, and it's very annoying. Be honest and direct. Avoid negatives. I take out however, despite, although, all the time from grants. Be proud of yourself. Make clear summary statements where you need to in a long grant. It really helps the reviewer. Make a habit of using short words and phrases. I mean, myself is me. In order to is to. Not only, but also, which is very negative, is and. And if you want to say both and, that's fine. Previously published. If it's a past tense word, it's already previous. All experience is previous. Clinicians presents with, has, shows. Part of the reason this will be good for you is because there's character and word counts in lots of grants these days, and it will help you keep it short. But it also makes it easier to read. Use graphics and tables where you can, if you're allowed, for yourself and for the reviewer, because if it's a good graphic, and it doesn't need to be done by a graphic designer, it can be a very simple graphic. It just is useful to help guide reviewers. Once you have a first draft or a second draft or an early draft, you want to refine it. How do you do that? Well, you think about the reviewer as a reader, and you start looking at it not as the researcher, but as the reader. And people don't all read the same way. Some people still read on paper. Lots of people read on a variety of different scales of digital. And critical reading to review something is very different from passive reading for either entertainment, like a novel, or for learning something like a textbook, because you're critiquing it. We like to read through the whole grant as if you were the reviewer and do it on screen, do it on paper, doesn't matter. I always draw circles and arrows on paper, and you can't really do that on screen as easily. I mean, you can annotate a PDF, but it's not quite the same. Review in layers. One of the things that peeves me is when reviewers send back language comments because they've looked at language and they haven't looked at the science in this much depth. So think about layers. Think about the scholarship or science, which is the plan, the structure of the documentation and the flow of the documentation, which I call proposal, and the sentences and how everything is put together, and that's persuasion. Have I been persuasive? So you have to ask yourself different questions at each of these layers. I'm going to tell you about one of the exercises we do, which is called the key points exercise. You ask 2 or 3 readers to skim the proposal quickly, highlighting key points. You can do this electronically or on paper. And in the first skim, readers will often find different key points. Different things will pop for them. So what you want to do is you revise it to highlight what you think are the key points, and you ask them to do it again. And they will often find similar key points if you've done that. So key points should be at the beginning and end of paragraphs. This is just a bad schematic, ignore that. But like if you're highlighting them and they're at the beginning and the end of a paragraph, like here, that's good. If there's one that's in the middle, maybe this statement and that statement need to be at the beginning, or maybe that statement actually needs to be at the end, as in this example. Because sometimes you conclude when you're writing an early draft, you'll write a paragraph and then you go, oh, I forgot to say, and you'll add a bunch of stuff. Maybe you do the same thing down here and this paragraph got split in a funny way. Maybe you have something where it doesn't even make a key point and you can look at it and go, what am I trying to say here? It helps you figure those things out. Do you need to move them? Eventually, all paragraphs should have this structure. They should have a key point at the beginning, some details in the middle, and a key point at the end. Don't bold these necessarily because this is about readership and paragraph structure in English or French, which are the two languages you're submitting in if you're submitting in Canada. The other thing we sometimes review for is what I call general versus detailed content. And when you are doing, because this is also, that paragraph has every paragraph has general, detailed, general. That's the structure of a paragraph. That's the introductory statement, the details about what you're talking about, and the concluding statement. If you can review your grant in such a way that a section also has that you have some general information, then some detailed information, then you summarize it in general information across it, you get this fractal pattern. So the whole document at the front has the introductory and background sections, which are pretty general, the plan in the middle, which is pretty detailed, and then things about team and knowledge translation and timeline, maybe, or impact at the back end, which again are more general. And if you get this structure going across your grant, it will be easier to read. And it is more important in a longer grant than it is in a shorter grant. But even if it's a short grant, like, need to have this structure in order to make it easy to read. And so reviewing through for this kind of thing and then manipulating it around so that it kind of has this pattern makes it easier to read. Try reading your text in various ways. You can zoom in to look at fonts, emphasis, justification, figures, formatting, and you can zoom out to look at the big picture and the ease of reading, the flow, whether there's symmetry or asymmetry, which I didn't have time to talk about, balance of the amount of information across different pages. So, look at it closely as well as at the higher level. Give your text white space, and I've added this in because people do this all the time and it's really hard to read. This is exactly the same text, takes exactly the same amount of space and has a whole bunch of white space in it. Because I pulled this list out here and put some paragraph breaks in to start each of these at a different sentence. And it just spaces it and makes it a lot easier. So give white space. Then the final thing you do when you're finalizing your revision and getting ready to submit is you go back and look at the funding opportunity and make sure that you have addressed the review criteria and you've followed the instructions for anything that's online, anything that's about grant structure and format, including font, that you've aligned with review criteria. This is an example of what CIHR cares about, and these they don't use anymore, but notice that plan was 50%, and over here, plan is only 20% if you're a SHRC person. But this has not changed. This is the same as it is now. So you want to go and ask yourself these questions before you submit it. You want to make sure your plan is realistic, appropriate, and feasible, that your team has the expertise and experience, that your budget is appropriate and justified, and there are no fatal flaws. Fatal flaws are very rare, so I can give a couple examples if someone wants one, but they're not that. And that you have followed all the instructions. I have a top 10. Understand the process, read the instructions, think before writing, map your project, be realistic. Don't forget these new priorities, which shift all the time. Your first draft should be a mess. Use graphics effectively. Review your content, then the text, the language, and refine for easy review by putting things where the reviewer will see them, by not burying things in the middle of paragraphs that are key points your reviewer needs to see, and by using clear, short sentences and clear language. So thank you very much. I know I've pushed it a little bit further than I
It's
have.
okay, Dawn. There's a a lot of pearls in there, so thank you for all of that. Um, I see we're getting close to 1 o'clock, so some people might need to go. But Dawn, are you okay to stay a few extra
Yep,
minutes to answer questions?
yep.
Sure. Do people have questions? I don't see anything in the chat yet. Oh, Genevieve?
Thank you very much for that excellent presentation, Don. I wanted to let the group know that Cheryl Willington is also offering a grant writing workshop for faculty, and she has space in that. It'll start in January. It also includes a competition for grant funding. It's two prizes of $15,000 each. And the other piece, Cheryl Willington also had asked the department to create a dashboard to see where faculty members are successful at obtaining grants. And we're working through that data, but if people are interested to know the agencies where our faculty have had the most success, whether they're clinical or academic, we can do that analysis for them.
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks, Genevieve.
Thanks, Elaine. I'm very big on thinking things through before you start writing them down.
Yeah,
Very big, because research is about thinking and doing and planning. And in the same way you plan anything else in your life, whether it's a surgery or a house renovation or whatever, you really need to think big picture before you can start going into the details. But then you need the details to make it a practical experience. And grants are very much the same. You're asking for money to do something that's actual practical in the real world. And the reviewer's saying, can you do that for that money? Do
yeah,
you have the skills to do that? Have you thought it through? Have you thought about the brick walls you're going to end up with? Or have you thought about what's going to happen if you can't recruit or, whatever? They want you to have thought it through.
yeah. And along those lines, if you're having trouble being convincing in your grant proposal, maybe you have to think, maybe I need to adjust my research questions.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And also, sometimes reviewers just don't get it. I have lots of experience, even with senior researchers with lots of experience writing grants, where um, the reviewers just didn't get it, and we had to go back and really think about it and show a different side of the project so that they would get it. Because you always assume your reviewer is an expert, but they almost never are. The reviewers are educated, tall, intelligent people, but they're not going to be an expert in your field. You are an expert in your field.
yeah,
Yes, and Ellen has made a good comment in the chat about, for community and patient engaged research, the consultation must take place before the grant writing and budgeting to make sure to compensate your partners. And that's another thing uh, that's important to bring up, is that everybody who is compensated for their contribution to your grant gets compensated at the same level. So the surgeon does not get $500 an hour and the patient $20 an hour. That does not fly. Everyone gets the same amount. So there are guidelines in the CIHR website for that. Thanks, James. You can come to the 12-hour one if you're really into it.
Uh, Don, I may have, I'm sorry if you did mention this, but have you any experience using large language models, things like ChatGPT?
Okay, so most funders do not disallow use
Right.
of those in a grant. Um, and so don't do it. If you want to do it for your own purposes, that's fine. I do find that there's a couple places where it might be really helpful. One is writing a lay summary. The second is if you're writing in a language that is not your most fluent language.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
But grant agencies disallow it.
Yeah,
So you can't use it. And
yeah,
reviewers are not allowed to use it either.
yeah. I see Helen's come on too. Helen, did
Yeah,
you have?
I will say something that I have used it for, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. Let's say I'm like one page too long. I will take some paragraph of my own written proposal, near final, put it in ChatGPT and say, please shorten by 10%. And then
Well,
it spits it my own text out 10% shorter.
yeah. Did it maintain the correct meaning?
Most of the time, although I do have to verify.
Yeah. So, I mean, use if you used that exact paragraph in a grant, it would nullify your grant application if they knew. You are not allowed to use it in a grant application.
Even to edit your own text.
No.
I mean, I imagine this is going to evolve over time because these tools are going to become more and more used. And so they're going to have to, similar the way universities have started to evolve already with regards to
So
class
again,
assignments.
I'm not an expert in this, but I will say two things about it. Under the current model, for example, one is using those tools means you're sharing your text with everyone. It becomes part of the body of knowledge. And if you wish to do that, that's up to you. But it is, there's an IP aspect to it that grant funders and probably publishers eventually are going to really disallow. So it's like a tool for your everyday life, but you can't necessarily use it in some of the situations where there's an IP aspect and where research integrity and rigor are a kind of an honor system. And so, you know, writing a literature using ChatGPT, what's the point if you have to go and read those papers to double check that it's all correct anyway?
Yeah, I think part of, like you mentioned, the non-native English speakers, I think that's
Well,
one,
even, I mean, it doesn't,
yeah,
so I'm just because you were born, English is your first language does not mean that you're a good writer by any stretch of the
of
imagination,
course. Yeah,
okay?
yeah,
And some people who learned English as another language are way better at it than lots of, you know, people who use English as their first language.
yeah,
The issue is about the, not about grammar checking, because you can use Word to grammar check,
yeah.
okay? You